Thank you very much, Roland, and thank you too for attending the third lecture, which I hope will at least convince you that unlike the first two, I actually have done fieldwork, and I believe in ethnography, and the richness of my material, of the Yoruba material, I should say, because it's not mine, it's theirs, and I've been able to, I've been honored to have the opportunity, really, to spend a good many years making my way up to, as I said last time, about primary six. I'm about primary six in terms of Yoruba culture, meaning I'm a sixth grade student at the elementary school level, at the top of my class, I should tell you, yeah, sixth grade. So I thought I should start by at least showing you non-Africanists where it is I work. I kind of assume everybody knows West Africa, if not the whole continent, and that's really unfair because I couldn't do South Asia like this, or really the United States either for that matter. But so on the left you can see is a pretty standard post-colonial map of Africa, and Nigeria is often heralded as the giant of Black Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, in terms of population, but also in terms of its oil wealth, and that's been a mixed blessing. The huge proportion of revenues that come from oil create shortages in other areas. When it's cheaper to import food abroad, then the domestic production suffers. So it's been called the Dutch disease, as you may well know, from the tulip trade in Netherlands. And then on the right, just to sort of follow the circle, you can see Nigeria as a whole here, which is the red one on the left, and the green one circled by red. And then there's also two circles. The first one is going to be the 19th century stretch of the Ibadan Empire, to which the town I'm talking about, Ayede, belonged and then broke from. And then the smaller little tiny circle here is going to show up on the next map. So here's a map representing the mid-19th century, the period after the old Oyo Empire collapsed, due largely to the end of the legal slave trade, where the British abolished it, and it lingered, of course, but the revenues that were accrued to the Oyo in the 18th century dried up and created a crisis, a vacuum, a power vacuum, and the Ibadan Empire grew up, and all the way to the east, the northeast. This cluster of three kingdoms is where I did my work, a comparative study actually, because Ishan and Itaji, to the north and south of Ayede, here you see them more closely, are traditional so-called mini-states, very decentralized, where you have rotating kingships that rotate between the quarters of the town. And in Ayede, you have a centralized autocracy that was fueled in the mid-19th century by a warrior named Eshubi, who crowned himself king. And what I did was I analyzed the relationship between the ritual cult system and the political system by looking at historically at what happened when a decentralized model became centralized. And not surprisingly, the ritual system gets centralized as well, but not passively, and that's my whole point. The whole point is that the ritual system is the bottom line of politics and power. And I'm going to start reading now, and forgive me if I've set my alarm here, and I'm going to leap to the conclusion if I leave you hanging, but I've cut 30% of it as it is, so forgive me. And I'll try not to read too quickly. I start with two quotations, one from the philosopher Paul Ricoeur, where he says, "Before the consulted or constituted archive, there is the archive of things." And that's in his huge volume on history, memory, and forgetting. The other quote comes from the Yoruba historian, Toyin Falola, who also has worked on ritual archives, and I don't mean to venture into this area without citing him. He has a much more capacious concept than I do, in which the archive is transatlantic and consists of all sorts of permeable entering and exiting spirits. But it's the same idea. Ritual archives, he says, deal with ancestral legacies and indigenous concepts and epistemologies. So I covered a little bit of that in the first lecture, and I'd like to pay my tribute to this extraordinary intellect. He teaches at the University of Texas in Austin, and he's written something like 50 books already, and he's a ridiculous powerhouse. So I start my lecture now, a little bit autobiographical. It was my first day of fieldwork in the historic Ekiti Yoruba kingdom of Ayede, and I woke up early and starving. Cocks were crowing in what seemed like an orchestrated call and response. Goats were bleating with punctuated sforzandi, and smoke was rising up from the cooking hearths of the multiple compounds surrounding my landlady's house, where I rented an upstairs flat, wedged between localized household groups, ile, and more extended patrilineages, idile, loosely organized into what anthropologists called wards or quarters, even when there are 6 of them, and the Yoruba called adugbo, in sets of nested relationships that would take me 3 decades to figure out, but I think I finally did it in about 2013. And there was also an undulating human call and response drawn from that magnificent Yoruba repertoire of greetings for early morning that inquire how you slept, how you got up, how you arrived, how you are sitting, how you had visitors the day before, how you are welcome, with follow-up refrains and formulaic elaborations tailored to comings, passings, and goings within Yoruba divisions of afternoon, evening, and night that differ, well, actually, morning, late morning, afternoon, evening, and night that differ significantly from their Western counterparts. Ekaro, ekason, ekale, and I forgot ekurole. Those are the divisions. Ekaro, that's good morning. Shedada loji, did you sleep well? Ekuale jolana, greetings for having visitors yesterday. So it can just go on forever. You walk outside and you are just enveloped in discourse relationships. A sociolinguistics linguist would have a field day there. As the only Oyibo or European around, I found myself a reluctant celebrity, conspicuously visible like human matter out of place and nowhere to hide, and quickly surrounded by a small gang of young bloods, some of whom would become my trusted teachers and field assistants, and others I later learned who were just looking for an opening. But I had more immediate issues to think about, like where and what I would eat. It was a market day, the rural periodic kind, which recur every 4 days, 5 in Yoruba, which include day 1 in their reckoning, and is presided over by a town shrine to the trickster god Eshu, deity of the crossroads. For what better junction than a central market that exchanges money for commodities along converging local and long-distance routes, which included human captives for sale in the past. And the ring market system has been diagrammed by the geographer Greg Hodder, and it's a little misleading only because he has 7, and they normally repeat after 5. So pretending that this is Ayede instead of Akinyele, you have Ayede market on day 1, and then on day 2, the same market women will go to Ojo and sell their wares. Then on day 3, they'll go to Iware. Day 4, Elekeru. Day 5, Ijaye, and then back to Ayede. And what happens is that these cycles interlock. So some people from neighboring towns will go to some of those same market days, but not others. They'll go to other ones that the Ayede market women don't go to. So it's a bit like chain mail, a whole kind of tissue of exchange relations and circulation relations that really extend from Cameroon up to Senegambia. That's why you find such a broad distribution of commodities from Europe, from China, and historically from other parts of Africa for so many years. Eshu receives palm oil on market days to cool down those volatile varieties of fetishism associated with commodities and their shape-shifting value forms. Wizards from afar who can turn young children into goats, and then into calabashes full of brand new Naira notes. This is called iluki. It's a very lukudi. It's a very dangerous kind of money magic made out of the blood of children and humans as a conversion, because blood circulates in the human body the way money and commodities circulate in the collective body, in the body politic, and in the through circuits of exchange. Eshu, okay. And then also, it's a place where political rivals with the right juju medicine can remove a chief's penis and render him impotent. And of course, the omnipresent witches, Ajay, often posing as market women, sometimes sitting over holes that hide their long demonic tails and sucking you in with their nefarious exchange. If the price is too good, it's because you are the product. But I was starving, so my growing posse took me to a food stand in the market where I could buy cooked rice with meat pepper soup. It was burning and bursting with delicious flavor, and I washed it down with fresh, undiluted palm wine, the good stuff, morning tap, not diluted with water yet. As I took my food, Olu Fagbemi, the first to grab my hand that morning and take control, lectured me on the dangers of eating alone in the market. It was not safe. One could be poisoned. I had to know the trustworthy sellers. It was populated with witches. These witches, he said, they are wicked. They look like ordinary people, but they are actually upside down. I replied while stuffing my face that everybody I could see was sitting, standing, or walking right side up, so I didn't see anything to fear. He replied, to see them, you have to stand up, bend down, and look through your legs. And he bent down to look between his open legs to demonstrate the point. It's like all the way. I stood up and followed his example. But Olu, now everybody is upside down. I responded as the blood rushed into my admittedly hungover head. Ah, you need a special juju to put in your eyes. Then you will see the witches. They will be the ones right side up. And so I was introduced by techniques of the body to what we might call the Yoruba principle of inversion, turning or capsizing, yi in Yoruba, and it's used in incantations, by which kings are decapitated, the last become first, and the social coordinates of the corporeal field are reversed or restored, depending on which part of the cycle you're in a kind of indexical mise en abîme. I never did acquire the necessary medicine in my substantial collection, which would enable me to perceive those upright witches who were really upside down, but I was thus introduced to a world in which appearances could indeed be deceptive. Danger was hiding in the light, and in which the body, as Pierre Bourdieu would say, was a savvy geometer, transposing the habitus through scheme transpositions, in this case of up and down, thereby reversing the Cartesian coordinates of the marketplace. And I just want to give you a visual reference to market women. On the upper slide in particular, these are market women who bring usually their husband's produce. This is a very highly gendered division of labor in which men do the farming and women sell their husband's produce. And it gives rise to all sorts of tensions within households and lineages. But I want you to pay attention to the calabash, both as a container of in this case, I believe it's palm wine. They're bringing palm wine from the forest into the market. And then as vehicles of conveyance. They become measures of exchange value and containers of it that accumulate exchange value through mobility, because you always pay a little more for something in the market than you do from its source. It's going from wholesale to retail. And then below is just a generic example, not from my field site, of a market woman in front of her stall. But they are highly organized within all kingdoms. They're organized into egbe associations, which are modeled on which witchcraft covens are modeled. So there's a very tight correlation between women's roles as market women and their potential witchcraft. And then I want you to see on the right, as we will come to this soon in the lecture, Igba Yemoja. This is Yemoja's calabash. This is one of the most powerful ritual icons in the entire annual festival series of worship to the Orisha. And this is the kind of Think of it as a sort of a nuclear reactor that has the capacity to blow the entire region apart if it breaks or cracks open, but which is necessary to channel in order to revitalize the kingdom and basically reproduce society. And from last Monday's lecture, the slide below, I was showing the way in which priestesses process through the town, through the kingdom during a festival, very much like currencies. And their red and white is reproductive of value. And you can see the homology between the market women processing into the center of the town and the priestesses, most of whom are market women themselves, doing the same thing. I'm just giving you a little glimpse of the sort of micro-sociology underlying both the domestic and lineage dynamics. Very simple point I want to make here, which is that as market women do well, when they actually generate profits, it's a mixed blessing because, of course, the household prospers. The husband doesn't have to pay for his wife's upkeep. They're not even expected to. But at the same time, it generates competition between the children of co-wives because the children of a successful market woman will have more wealth coming to them than the children of a less successful one. Hence, there are witchcraft accusations that generate between co-wives that create a normative pattern where each co-wife has her own hearth to cook for her children because it's just axiomatic that no matter how well you get along with your co-wife, she will try to poison your children. And very often, if you lose a child to illness or you can't get, you keep having stillbirths, it's because there's a co-wife trying to keep you down. So on the lineage level to the right, moving from a household dynamic to a corporate lineage of several generations, the lines of segmentation and fission are created between the breaks between full siblings and half siblings. In other words, co-wives become the axis on which lineage segmentation and ultimately fission take place. So these differential phenomenon associated with redness and rupture and sometimes violence are offset by the placating, soft suturing values of ritual power. But Ashe has both. There's always both. It's a very dualistic kind of system. And then in some cases, Barnes called this lineage, John Barnes, lineage optation. You're familiar from classic social anthropology. In a patrilineal society, complementary filiation represents the kinship relations that a son or daughter will have with the mother's side of her mother's or patrilineage, or her mother's brother's patrilineage, and the same with a man in relation to the more disciplined authority structures of the patrilineage as such. But in cases where a market woman can become so much wealthier than her husband that a son or sons will opt into her, it's really not matriline, it's really her patriline. But it's a kind of matrilineal move. It's a form of co-optation that the wife's lineage has the potential to steal your children. And what do witches do? They steal your children. They turn their blood into money. So there's a kind of anxiety around wealthy market women that generates witchcraft fears associated with lineage, fission, and optation. If we began the last lecture walking backwards out of the Ogboni Lodge, we enter today Yoruba land by bending over and looking through our opened legs at a social world of endless socio-spatial revolutions. Crossroads are important in the socio-spatial landscape because they establish fixed points of intersection, as do shrines standing independently on incorporated into palaces or houses. They stand at the intersection between pathways converging in every town. The marketplace has pathways coming into it from the outside. And the vertical axis of the gods and spirits up in the sky, Orum rather, all around us, Aye, and extending beneath the earth, Ile, or water, down into the realm of the dead, the ancestors. And as we shall see, that which is ontologically deep, ibu ijinle, the depth of deep depth. Royal crowns are adorned with witch-like birds, for example, and I just want you to see the birds on top of the crown, and then as a king, the Ataoga of Oshogbo here wears it. And note that his feet don't touch the ground either. And these birds allow a king to see panoptically, as it were, hovering above the kingdom from a bird's eye perspective. So the location of the bird on top is like a panopticon. It's like a bird's eye view. And part of what the king is the king is really a space of intersecting vectors. Spatial, right, left, up, down, front, back, but also temporal, because he embodies, literally, the corporeality of former kings. He is the terminus of a living lineage. As mapped by the body, these vectors of ritual power associate up and above with the high god, Olodumare, and Odudua, the Orisha of original kingship from Ile-Ife, down or below, Abe, with the deep realm of the dead, of Onile, the Ogboni earth deity of judicial execution. To the right, Otun, with the powers of coolness, normativity, balance, healing, suturing, or fusion of the body politic. Associated with whiteness, breast milk, semen, salt, kola nut, snail fluid. We looked at Omiero last time, which clots the blood, literally clotting the blood if you're a hemophiliac. And also the ritually rejuvenating water of Omitutu, or Otun. The left, on the other hand, literally on the other hand, with the powers of hotness, counter-normativity. That would be associated with the powers of witchcraft in the household and structural fission and optation in the lineage. Redness, blood, fire, subversion, and a broad range of destabilizing curses and medicines. Two spatial coordinates of the corporeal field further associate with temporal vectors. In front, or Iwaju, extending into the future, and behind, Ain, leading back into the past. And a good example of this in material form are the Janus-faced Epa masks and the royal crowns. Looking forward, they have faces on the front and the back, and certain medicines with multiple eyes via cowrie shells. There's one medicine called Ojumerin that looks in 4 different directions, 4 eyes. And then there's Agbonadero, hot becomes cool, with its 8 eyes, Oju Edjo. And this medicine can, whatever lightning bolt somebody hurls at you to knock you off to your feet and kill you, will simply turn it into a loving, soft substance. That's your very strong protection, Agbonadero. So these are all sort of indicative in the sense of indexing the pathways that emanate from the body itself, the social body. So there's a valued blessing, Jekowonyi Amalo, Siwaju, literally, may your hands go forward in front of you. And the meaning is, may you achieve honor and wealth in the future. That's where your path is heading. And it elicits the typical response, Ashe, it will be, may it come to pass. Again, a kind of ratification of a future tense. When one Ogboni member passes another, he or she may exhort, Ogboni Wayne. Ogboni, look behind you, eliciting a response, something to the effect that there are no children behind me, signifying, among other things, that the Ogboni prepare the ground for future offspring, to be born, as in Ogboni initiates. So now I want to start preparing the entrance to the ritual archive in Yoruba. Most people, including historians, access archival collections by entering the buildings, libraries, reading rooms, and special collections where the relevant primary source material is organized and stored, just like the Frobenius archive. Usually after an authorization process that may require credentials, letters of introduction, filling out and signing forms, agreeing to rules of use, paying maybe a nominal fee, receiving a card. You become a citizen, in effect, with this identity card, navigating the security checkpoints at entrances, exits, and thresholds, within and in some archives, swearing a witnessed oath. The first time I conducted research at the Rhodes House Library and in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, I had to swear an oath. They stopped doing that, but in the early 90s, that's what they did. You swore an oath that you wouldn't mess up their material. What I'm getting at are the ritual foundations of any archive, right? Documents are identified and requested with catalogs, indices, finding aids, and call numbers based on specialized metadata and library master codes, like the North American Dewey Decimal Classification System and its European Universal Decimal Classification sibling. It is not too much of a stretch to approach Yoruba towns and shrines to the Orisha called Ipara Orisha in the Ekiti region with similar protocols and master codes in mind. One does not simply walk into a Yoruba town shrine, especially during its festival time, without special permissions, offerings, and mandatory greetings, usually reserved for the king's palace if the Orisha is royal, or Ekuodun, greetings for the festival, followed by formal prostration in front of the priestesses and their central altar. Entrances are no mere doorways, but serve as guarded checkpoints packed with all manner of ritual firepower. Ogun's Mariwo cloth, which we talked about last time, it's palm fronds that are soft on the side but cut on the edge. Eshu's guardian effigy at every doorway, and juju medicines to smoke out malefactors, thwart saboteurs, and detect malicious intentions with X-ray precision. You walk into a shrine and you see just hanging there are all sorts of bundles, and each one has a particular ritual role to play to make sure if you are not worthy of entry, you will not come through. These shrines are like countries into themselves, with their own prerogatives of ritual citizenship, in some cases offering sanctuary to criminals in the past. I have a slide coming up of exactly one such place. They are also repositories of very special collections, holding classified material in both the logical and sociological senses of the term. First, according to hierarchies of deities, clustered around dominant Orisha in flexible pantheons, and second, by rules restricting access to cult initiates and specialists under highly regulated conditions of ritual activation. Such doubly classified material is accessed not with cataloged call numbers, I've mentioned this earlier too, but by calling on the Orisha in a marked chanting mode, Orisha Pipe, which brings buried pasts into the present. And I just want to show you the Epa mask that looks into the future and the past. This is the front view, and then you can't see it too well, but whoops, this is you can see that the back is also has a head and a person looking forward. And I want to draw attention to the soup. Art historians divide these masks into the base, which is uniform. All Epa masks have a base that is worn on the head of the channeler, of the priest, of the worshiper. And then the superstructure varies. And in this case, the superstructure is jagun jagun, which is a Yoruba term, fight fight, which means a warrior. And he's wearing a kind of characteristic northern hat. They often are depicted on horseback because he's representing a Nupe conqueror. But I want you to see how the base and the superstructure both look forward and back, doubling the temporal sight lines into parallel on the bottom prototype, crown helmet of kingship, and historically on top, instantiated vectors, in this case a warrior. And on the lower right is a Epa mask I photographed back in 1984, and it was a very unusual opportunity because this was the first time the mask was being performed. We think of any kind of ritual that the anthropologist wants to study has to be, old. It does, but it doesn't. What has to be old is the cultural logic, the ritual logic under which it's reproduced. What was happening in this particular context is that a new chief had just been kind of co-opting and kicking out one of the former chiefs in a quarter called Inisa. And the only reason I know this is that I'd been getting a lot of oral histories from this former chief, and he was in such a terrible state because not only had this new chief commissioned a new EPA mask to basically legitimize and establish his newly found authority, but in the process, he also stole away the old chief's wife. So talk about insult to injury. I mean, the suffering that goes on in rural societies, it's rough. It's rough. I'll get to this in a second. Okay, so now I'm going to move into Yoruba concepts of history, or at least what gets translated into English as history and into German as Geschichte. Thank you. I've never really known how to pronounce that. I'm sorry. To prepare the ground for entering the Yoruba ritual archive, I begin with ideas associated with Itan, history, Awo, secret or mystery, and Ashe, verbal order, command, or ritual power. And these concepts form something between overlapping semantic fields and an interdefinability set. In the early days of my research on Orisha worship, I was confused by responses to my self-presentation as a student seeking knowledge about the traditions, Asha, of the local Orishas, which in the kingdom of Ayede were associated with three major shrines of Yemoja, Orisha Ojuna, and Orisha Iyagba, which latter one was otherwise known as Iyelori, although I would eventually appreciate how these deities were hardly discrete entities, but manifested in multiple combinations and modalities within polythetic classes. Apart from the fact that what seemed like a rather anodyne topic, history, was tantamount to an outsider entering a military base proclaiming, "I am here to steal your nuclear weapons," and that one chief advised me, "Oyibo, you're wasting your time. These priestesses will never reveal their secrets." I was often, nonetheless, warmly greeted by those who knew better than I how nice it was that I had come to learn their history, or Itan. "No," I said, "I am an anthropologist, not a historian, pursuing questions about ritual power, and these require different kinds of data." But I soon learned not to push back, and eventually realized that there was more to Yoruba conceptions of history than meets the European ear. We can begin with matters of place and delivery, as they bear on the contents of specific historical narratives. First, it became immediately clear that historical narratives, whether solicited during formal interviews or performed in ritual contexts, were intimately associated with specific locations, whether bounded or open, such as shrines, sacred groves, the multiply gated domiciles one finds in Yoruba land, or seemingly arbitrary spots on a road or pathway that turned out to be unmarked graves and former shrines in states of desuetude, decay. It was no accident that my first formal interview about Ayede's historical landscape was with the king, the Oba, in his palace, Afin, doubling as part diplomatic protocol, requiring a customary offering of schnapps and kola nuts, sweetened, as you can be sure, with cash, for literally paying my respects, while seeking his blessing to take up residence and pursue my research. And it was also part fieldwork, beginning at the top of the traditional political hierarchy. Formally introduced to the palace parlor, or in the palace parlor, where the official meetings of the king and council take place every 2 weeks, I received the official version of Ayede's dynastic history in the designated space of political deliberation. How Eshubi, a powerful war chief from the Ekiti kingdom of Ikole, but also somehow from Iye, rose up against marauding Nupe slave raiders in the 19th century and led the townspeople to the safe haven that became the historic military stronghold of Ayede. Also, how after planting a spear in what became the town's central Idia tree, he would represent the Ibadan Empire's most easterly outpost, for which he received a crown and became the Ata of Ayede. But here again, a rival tradition maintains that he received the title from the Ata of Igala in Ida, further to the northeast, and that how he thereafter decamped from Ibadan to join the Ekiti-Parapo alliance to push the Ibadans back, so he switched sides. I recall my initial disappointment with the 3 carved statues of colonial officers that flanked the king's throne. By the way, this is in 1983, so you have to understand how historically limited my understanding was. in anthropology in those days. I thought that colonial statues were bogus. I wanted the real ones, the really old ones, right? In search of the primitive, as Stanley Diamond put it. I ignorantly thought they were corrosive traces of colonial modernity rather than time-honored instruments for mimetically acquiring outside power, which is what they were. It's just another iteration of a very old strategy. You bring the outside in, and if the outside dominates you, you appropriate that domination and you influence it from inside. As for the official dynastic history recounted in the palace, ratified by the recitation of Eshubi's official oriki or relay, this is a genre called praise of origin or praise poetry, I would come to appreciate the multiple versions and revisions that I later encountered in different spaces, including those that undermined Eshubi's legitimacy and the entire dynasty that he founded by invoking his treachery or contesting his origins, whether offered by the high priest of Orisha Alua within the confines of his shrine, which we will see, itself a space of displaced kingship, or intimated in songs sung by the devotees from Ayede's stranger quarters, honoring rival gods and kings of their distant towns of origin. Here's the, actually, I seem to have, here's the priest of Olua who was actually, he descends from the former Ea kingship, the original town that, from which Eshubi migrated, and he was displaced. And the telltale sign of his former kingship is the, it looks like a leopard skin, but it's actually a civet cat skin. And that is the trace of his former royalty. And as this is the shrine where if a criminal escapes, even from the local police station, and finds his or her way into this shrine and is lucky enough to touch the leg of this priest, all charges have to be dropped. Well, that's what they say anyway. But this is a very interesting case of what happens to a formerly displaced dynasty. Well, it's given, it's kind of, it's, what would you call it? It's sort of, you take the power away and it's a compensation, you give them ritual authority. But we'll hear more from him in due course. The reason I wanted you to see these shrines in Ibadan to Shango, the deity of Oyo kingship, but also of thunder and lightning, is partly because it shows you sort of what an archive looks like, a ritual archive, both on the outside and on the inside. And what I like about these two watercolors by Karl Ariens, who was on Frobenius' team when he embarked on the Fourth Inter-African expedition from 1910 to 1912, and this is one of the first places he started to study. Among other things, I think it's a very interesting visual technique because on the left we see a kind of slightly wide-angle view of the shrine, and then if you pay attention to this little silk or whatever it is, and the posts, and even what's going on, you'll realize that this is a close-up on the right. So we're kind of zooming in. So even though you can be sure that Ariens and Frobenius were not allowed inside, at least not at that preliminary point, look at how much he's peering in and how much he's giving us access. And you can just see various arrangements and of the Laba Shango. These are panels that the priests wear that evoke the cloth of kingship. And a lot of the velvet is kingship, but a lot of the velvet is covering and hiding a lot of power objects underneath. And that's the whole part of the essence of Secret Swallow's Secret, is that there's always something behind something, behind something, behind something. So that's kind of, that's where the archives are. How you access them is through ritual practice. And this one, I'm sorry to say, it belongs to a part of the text I had to cut, but this is from inside the Ata Vaede's palace. It took me years to get in here. And when I finally did, I learned that not only does the inner sanctum protect and hold the 16 crowns that belong to the Ata Vaede and represent different powers that he must acknowledge when associated with different rituals and festivals, but also of different kings. But I also learned that the skulls of the former kings are buried underneath. And it's very important to understand that relationship between crown and head, but also between visible icon and invisible historical content underneath. There is history underneath these crowns, even if it's just the history of a record of who the ruling Atas, the ruling kings, were. So I'm skipping to secrecy. So the second concept after Iton, history. So the deepest histories are secrets. They bleed into the category of secrecy, and so does the narrative genre of their recitation. As one Opiton, one historian told me, he said the deepest histories are conveyed through incantations. And they're not just any incantations. They're incantations that reproduce the speech of the first people. So they're quotes. So it's quoted speech. I'll get into that. Secrecy, awo, and the term for a diviner is babalawo, is father of secrets, and we'll see why that's important. If Yoruba histories are systematically linked to specific spaces where they are archived, invoked, and voiced through various speech registers and narrative genres, mostly performed in mixed modes, they are also protected within nested hierarchies of secrecy and levels of initiation in which the deepest histories are serially sequestered, as captured by the Yoruba password, awo jawolo, awo legbawo mi tori tori. Secret surpasses secret. Secret can swallow secret completely. And I've called this elsewhere the central axiom of Yoruba hermeneutics. The Yoruba philosophy of the secret is complex and profound, perfusing all aspects of discourse, ritual, political economy, and social life. But its relevance to history, what we call history anyway, matches a quotative form of historicity tracing back to the first time, lai in Yoruba, of the ancestors, with a politics of destabilization resulting from the recuperation of censored pasts. That's why deep speech is dangerous. You're really not supposed to voice it, and when you do, it has consequences. Such resurrected utterances are sometimes prefaced by the disclaimer, "It is not my song, it is the song of my father." Erimiko, orim babamini. It's not my song, it's my father's song, where Baba stands in for an eponymous male ancestor, or even the deity itself. It's not necessarily what we would consider to be the father of the narrator. This quotative form of historicity is clearly illustrated, but by no means limited, to two modes of revelatory disclosure. The Ijala chants sung at the funerals of important hunters, generating rival versions of the decedent's past, and the corpus of 246 mythopoetic verses, called essay, of Ifa divination, organized into 16 mytho-historical pathways called Odu. You know, there's been a lot of work done on Yoruba numbers and numerology and on the significance of 16 and 256. It's basically 2 to the exponential value of 2 to the exponential value of 2. And there's a very interesting scholar, Helen Varenne, who has really changed our understanding of Yoruba culture, really, by disclosing a semantics of quantification that is very different from the kinds of number theory we're used to here. Basically, to put it in its most basic form, numbers are not sets of objects, but rather numbers are manifestations of one set to the degree of 5, to the degree of 6, to the degree of 7. It's a decompositional model rather than an additive one. And it changes the whole way in which we understand classification itself in a Yoruba context. The idea of having a kind of fixed hierarchy of relations of inclusion and exclusion actually violates a lot of the indigenous logic. And it's very close to what in engineering theory is called fuzzy logic, not in the sense of logic that's not clear, but logic that is so precise that it captures degrees of overlap and underlap. And it does that by suspending the law of the excluded middle, actually creating a kind of three-valued logic that mathematicians in Poland worked on in the early 20th century. It's very interesting stuff. But in any case, these 246 odu are signs. They're tosses of a diviner's equipment that each contain hidden history that is brought into the present, not in order to inform the client about the past, but in order to solve the client's problem. So it's not cognized as the history the way we would think of it. Without engaging their rich figurations of form and content, I will only here highlight how in the former chanting mode, hunters, going back to Ijala, begin by praising their fallen comrade with those oriki orile, those praise poems of origin, linking him to his ancestor's town of origin, and also offering rival accounts of his past that quickly develop into shouting matches, where each participant interrupts the last with the refrain, "Ironi, that's a lie," and then kind of bumps that person out in the middle of their discourse and takes center stage to provide the true oriki, as voiced by the ancestors, until he too is cut off as a liar, and so on, sometimes for hours. Although the ritualized atmosphere of Ijala chanting is jocular, it's jovial, I've seen hunters come to serious blows over their rival versions of the past, framed not only in relation to what is true and false, but also ratified by variant quotations of deep original speech, often marked by archaisms in embedded phrases and incantations. This is very interesting, is how a lot of the deep ritual speech contains archaic words. And if you're a linguist, you can actually reconstruct migrations through historical semantics of those archaisms. A parallel logic of quotative reiteration characterizes the historical logic of Ifa divination that I was mentioning, the verses, which are brought into play by the coded correspondence between the 16 cowries, alternatively the 16 units on an opale brass chain, cast by Babalawo on his divining board. The textual correlates of each cast, as collected in the 256 verses of each of the 16 odu, and the Iere chanting mode through which they are vocalized. And I just want to show, again, with the help of Mathilde here, the fabulous feeling of contact when you see Frobenius' notebook. He's one of the first Europeans, not the first, but one of the earliest, to actually document the complex system of Ifa divination as he worked on it in the town of Ibadan. And then it was Ricard Kuba who told me that when you find a blue line running through his field notes, it means that he incorporated into one of his books. And here we have on the right, I call this from Frobenius' field notes to book, we have his more formalized, including a diagram of the tray itself, which of course relies heavily on cardinal points. Ifa on the top, Eshu on the bottom, and all sorts of different things. It's a crossroads too, of course. Look at the crossroads on the right. You see how this plays out. And this is itself a kind of concentrated form of archived history. So barring for now the ways actual historical references become incorporated into these ancient verses, such as the founding and migration of kingdoms, the advent of Islam, this is all referred to in Ifa divination, or the introduction of firearms into Yoruba land, the imputed truth value of what Wande Abimbola characterizes as historical poems derives from the original divinatory casting, essentially a primordial precedent, which they reference and reiterate to illuminate the client's problem and prescribe the right sacrificial offering. Every divinatory casting is thus a recasting of an original divination. Just as you have incantations that reproduce the incantations of the first ancestors, so you have divination casts that recast the original divinations of the first ancestors. So this logic of reproduction, of quotation really, in its metapragmatic form of indexicality is central to the forms of historicity the forms of bringing the past into the present that are involved in this process. So here's one example. Every divinatory casting is thus a recasting of an original divination and the text which it nominalizes as the original diviner. So we find a cast that reads like this: "The head that should not go naked will find a cloth seller when the market opens, was the one who cast Ifa for the king of Ophat who sells a box full of velvet." That's a complicated textual structure right there. But what it does, apart from the complexities, it portends that the client for whom this cast came up will be recognized, will wear a crown, will become great like a king. But also it echoes a possible dynastic transition from one ruling house to another in Opha's political past, the kingdom of Opha, thereby portending a dramatic improvement in the client's inheritance. Hey, you've got a kingdom coming, guy. You better bring money now and make that sacrifice or it won't happen. They couldn't care less about history as history. They care about history as an indicator of where your life is going and how you should make the best of it. Now I get to Ashe, the third term in our interdefinability set. Above all else, their hidden histories, protected secrets, and bottomless depths of esoteric knowledge. Shrines, like palaces, are safeguarded repositories of Ashe, that latent capacity to make a difference, activated by a felicitous speech act, such as commanding, praying, blessing, cursing, often reinforced by sacrificial blood, ritually charged stones, okuta, and for negative attacks, a viscous black medicine called afoshe that can be swallowed or pressed into an antelope horn, which one holds like a microphone to direct and amplify an incantation. I first experienced this medicinal ashe at the tender age of 20 during my very first trip to Nigeria, funded by a summer travel fellowship before my senior year in college, for research on talking drums and Gelede festivals. It turned out that was much too difficult for me, but it got me hooked. During this stint, I befriended a lecturer at the University of Lagos who invited me to his hometown of Iwo for its annual Egungun festival, where masked lineage ancestors, some decked out in lavish finery, others like freshly exhumed corpses wrapped in rags, danced with vengeance throughout the town during the day and receded into hidden ceremonies at night. So I have this photo from that trip. This is my first escapade. And I'll date myself. I'll say this was in 1977, if you can believe that. So on the upper left, we have what's called a fancy masquerade. And what's interesting is that these aesthetic parallelisms and genres got picked up in circum-Atlantic carnival as well, fancy dress and fierce dress. In fact, that's where the terms come from. Here in Yoruba, it would just simply be, it would be funfun or itutu, the cool and stable one on the top, and it would be, bona, or it would be hot, it would be red below. But what you have here in a classic sort of social anthropology sense is representations of the corporate lineage identity decked out in finery. These are all cloths that are incorporating family cloths from different lineage segments into one. And it really represents that key characteristic of a corporate descent group, which is perpetuity, right? That it survives you. You pass through it. And then on the other side, you've got the masquerade as human being, representing the corporality, the humanness of the lineage, the human dimension that dies, decomposes, and cycles through the left hand into spirit form. So there's kind of a duality here. Anyway, it was to one of those, I didn't figure that out until 30 years later, but anyway, it was to one of those nocturnal affairs that I was invited by my host's associates, who turned out to be highly ranked Egungun officers. They were going to a secret meeting where they would distribute something special among themselves. Had I ever heard of Ashe? Did I know what it was? Would I like to swallow some? Yes, I had learned about it while researching a term paper for Professor Robert Ferris Thompson, whose inspiring course on aesthetic philosophies, quote, from West Africa to the Black Americas, served as the basis of his now classic book, Flash of the Spirit, which made an outsized impact on my life and thought. Yes, I knew a bit about Ashe, that it was connected to speech and ritual power, and that every Oba embodied so much of it that their eyes and mouths had to be covered by beaded fringe, descending from their crowns to protect their subjects from its deadly power. So if you think back to the image of the beaded crowns, the reason the beads fall over the king's mouth and eyes is because he has so much ashe that if it were revealed, it would kill the onlookers. That's why he has a king's linguist. That's why someone has to speak for him. And that is why he wears the beaded crown in public. And if you go online and look at these beaded crowns, you'll find all sorts of nonsense about how the beads represent the continuity of the lineage. Who the hell made that up? I have no idea. But that's one of the wonderful things about art history, is that you find these authoritative descriptions of cosmological values coded into X and Y and this and that. Some of it's good, but some of it's just, associated with the stability of the community. I mean, come on. Who told you that? How do you know that? But that doesn't mean that native exegesis is the end of interpretation either. And I fall into the dichotomies myself, because they are real in certain contexts. So anyway, I knew about ashe. It was connected to speech and ritual power, and that every oba had so much that they had to cover their heads. Yeah, I said. And yes, I would be honored to try some. What I didn't know at the time was that the genuine article contained part of a deceased oba's body, not raw or rotten, but exhumed, carbonized with other ingredients, and pulverized into a charcoal-like powder mixed with a viscous tar-like gel. If you consult the classic texts on Yoruba culture and kingship, which I hadn't done at that time, beginning with Samuel Johnson's History of the Yorubas, 1921, you will learn that no new king can be installed without eating the heart of his predecessor as a way of incorporating the ashe of the royal ancestors. Many years later, I would learn that it was not only the heart that was ritually prepared in this manner. And if you think about the male organ of procreation, you might have an idea of what other body part is actually used. Fortunately, I didn't know that at the time. Needless to say, after watching my Iwo elders ingest the preparation, I received my own large glob with a technique that I developed of physical suspension. I had learned how to cultivate this to swallow roasted grubs and various cooked animal parts that were otherwise outside of my comfort zone. I had this sense of saying, okay, just here it goes. But this was on an entirely different level. My hosts came close and watched with intense curiosity. At first, when the glob got stuck at the back of my throat, I retched and nearly choked. But as I relaxed in an extreme effort of mind over body, it slowly slithered down my esophagus and into my stomach. After genuinely heartfelt congratulations, they advised me never to curse anybody unless I was willing to live with the consequences. I do tell my students this in case they get a little too difficult. Watch it. Ashe, however, is much more than a medicinal substance. It is the substance of embodied history, a synthetic connective, linking sitting kings to their dead predecessors and the living to their ancestors. More generally, it connects language to objects and spirits in the world, including animals, trees, Orisha, and other people that are summoned, activated, and commanded by targeted speech acts that shift referential frames from named individuals to the lineages, quarters, and kingdoms that they represent. It also puts into practice a linguistic theory of reference. If a king is praised as Oba al-Ashe, the owner of Ashe, followed by Ekeji Orisha, second to the gods, it is because ultimately the Ashe of original kingship comes from Oduduwa and the multitude of Orisha who disseminated from Ile-Ife to found the first kingdoms and dynastic lineages, and on whom every living king depends and from whom he descends, directly through the patriline with major kings or cognatically with minor kings, notwithstanding that dynastic genealogical charters are particularly subject to political manipulation. So now let's turn to the multiple histories in motion. I can see that I'm also kind of out of time. So I'm going to have to skip the analysis of some festivals. This is an example of the Orisha Ojuna shrine that centralized some of the separate, the Olua cult that you saw is separate, but it has a representative in Ojuna and also a little shrine in the Ojuna shrine. Oloke is deity that is a complete stranger deity that comes from Ikole and gets incorporated into the royal cult. Here's Yemoja's calabash again, which she brings to the king in order to revitalize him for the following year. This is the moment when she sits on his laps. First she's coming out, okay. And then, I don't know how many of you have read this classic Fraser lecture by Evans-Pritchard called Divine Kingship Among the Shilluk, but there's this little moment in the procession where Naya King, the effigy of kingship, is placed on the sitting king and his body trembles. That's what happens here. The body of the king trembles as he's dead, by the way. He's socially dead at this point because he's been ritually decapitated, and then she brings him back into being. And the ritual rebirth is associated with the transfer of the ashe of the calabash. And now I'm just going to jump to the conclusion, if you'll bear with me. In the summer of 1990, I returned to Aede 5 years after my attenuated ethnographic baptism by fire, blood, and water, this time equipped with a video camera. It was a joyous homecoming, my many gifts received with those reproaches for staying away so long that are among the strongest expressions of Yoruba affection. Barriers of access that I had struggled to surmount were not only lifted, but in a surprising way, the tables had turned as the Orisha cults were now competing for my videography because it added value and prestige to their ritual activities at a time when evangelical Christians were gaining momentum in a renewed campaign against Satanism. Since I had covered 2 annual festival cycles during prior fieldwork, I could anticipate where to position myself to film critical moments of ritual passage. I knew the program and was familiar with the protocols, which is why during Yemoja's so-named king's sacrifice, Eboaba held one market day and thus 5 days prior to the day of carrying water when the king is reproduced. I was so surprised that Aede's king, for over 40 years, was not physically present to make his preparatory offering. So this slide shows the king when he was still attending the king's sacrifice in probably 1983 or 4, coming out of a successful divination that he would live to see the next year after severing the head of a goat. But in 1990, when I went back, he was alive, but he wasn't there. He had a representative holding his staff of office in that bush shrine. I was surprised that Aede's king was not there. Normally on this important day, the king processes with his royal entourage from the palace to Yemoja's secluded bush shrine, where he provides a ram, Shango's favorite food, to feed the Orisha associated with Yemoja, as well as spirits of the cult's former priests and priestesses, followed by a divinatory forecast of the year to come so that he can make the right sacrifices to remain on the throne. But on this particular day, he wasn't well, and his absence was alarming. The devotees proceeded as if nothing was amiss, casting the kola nuts without him under the gaze of his palace representative. They're in the bush shrine doing this sacrifice of a ram. Normally, after the ram is decapitated and his blood expended, his severed head is lifted and knocked against the king's head 3 times, signaling a shift to the Ogboni Society's domain of binding authority and judicial execution. The Ogboni number 3 is said to be powerful because the 3-legged stool never rocks. Stable, right on the earth. The tosses were ominous. The wrong signs kept turning up. Finally, the requisite pairing of kola nut segments emerged, but only after a long series of sacrifices was prescribed to avert the dangers of the coming year. I had previously figured out that per standard procedure, the king's sacrifice is of critical importance because in ritual terms, only symbolically, not physically, he is decapitated through the surrogate sacrifice of Shango's ram. And here you have a good case of paradigmatic substitution within a symbolic logic. The ram's severed head merges with the head of the living king, and there you have syntagmatic synthesis, initiating a 5-day acephalous vacuum in the kingdom when the king returns to the palace and remains in seclusion until the day of carrying water, when he is ritually reborn, recapitated, remembered, and recrowned. I think there's a certain amount of historical memory involved in the logic of suturing the king back together again. Such symbolic ritual regicide is necessary for the successful reproduction of the king in the kingdom, but it comes with risks. suspending his regular protections and opening the door to negative outcomes. It must be performed correctly as a necessary condition of remaining on the throne. On that sacrificial day, when Kabiesi, His Highness, was absent, I surmised that according to the modal logic of that particular ritual, which is necessarily, if not X, then Y. Necessarily, if the king is not there, then he won't live to the final year. He could not survive the following year. I kind of put that away in my mind. 3 years later, in 1993, when I returned again for another videotape expedition, I learned that it was his fifth wife, esteemed Ogboni society member and leader of Orisha Yagba's warrior priestesses, the Iya Ologun, who took his life. He was old and infirm, so his ailing mind and body posed a mortal threat to the body politic. If his demise was prefigured by his absence during the king's sacrifice, his presumptive successor was already in place during the day of carrying water, 5 days later, dressed in ritual whites while sitting in front of Ayede's erstwhile king as Yemoja's priestesses arrived, and showering them with new naira notes to invest in their support as they approached the throne. It is all on video, as plain as day to those in the know, a powerful festival subtext that shaped the future while hiding in the light of what most spectators experienced as the momentous celebration of an annual festival. I provide this final example of ritual prefiguration and its secluded idiom of the king's death and transfiguration to return to the Freudian problematic of the return of the repressed and its relation to the sacred archives of hidden histories. Regicides, whether ritual or real, or more likely in some dialectical combination of the two, belong to a species of parasite, particularly where kingship is prescriptively male and patrilineal, and kings are praised in patriarchal terms. After the king's sacrifice and during the day of carrying water, the priestesses converge on the palace to witness his rebirth, singing, "I am so happy, I found the Father home." That's the call. And then the response of the other priestesses, "I am so happy, I found the Father at home." And now we have a shift. "We are so happy, we found the Father at home." Response, "We are so happy, we found the Father at home." And this pronominal shifting from I into we indexes the participation framework of, it broadens it from the priestess, the top priestess in charge, to the entire community. The inclusive we, not the exclusive we. They are happy to find their father at home after his sacrifice in Yemoja's secluded grove, because there were no guarantees that he would survive until ritually reborn and recrowned, an interval when the kingdom is headless and fully belongs to the cults. Indeed, he returns from the grove as a dead man walking, wearing a diminished beaded cap designed with human skulls for the occasion, disappearing perhaps forever within his palace chamber. So in this particular example, you can see the skull. It's literally a skull cap. It's a cap of designed skulls, which mark the fact that he is socially dead. He's politically dead for the next 5 days. And he goes back into the palace and he's in seclusion. And then he has to be reborn. And that's when you saw the priestess lining up with the calabash to sit on him and literally rebirth him. So what forms of violence then? What is the relationship between Freud's originary parasite and the ritual regicide of a Yoruba king? What forms of violence and traumatic experience do they repress, misrecognize, and sublimate through repetitive strategies of substitution and displacement? And perhaps most problematically, are these repressed memories necessarily grounded in a primal event that actually took place? If this latter question dogged Freud and his devotees, separating true believers from doubters within his own flock, it also led Sir James Frazer and his acolytes to see ritual regicide as foundational to sacred kingship and necessary for its perpetuation through generational regicides that actually occurred. So Frazer actually took real regicide as the mechanism of devolution of kingship, that all kings had to be killed. And he also thought it happened almost every other year, which is absurd. But he's mistaking the ritual symbolism for the actual fact. My own experiences in Yoruba land, a few of them admittedly semi-traumatic, have led me to conclude that actual regicides like the one mentioned above actually happened and may well still occur, and that Freud and Frazer were onto something very profound regarding the ritual constitution of political authority. But the inaugural status of the original parasite remains mythic. as a fictional charter retrojected into the past. If Ricoeur's injunction that there can be a return of the repressed only if a traumatic event actually took place is to be respected, it need not and cannot apply to those myths of origin that posit primal parricides and regicides, but rather to those traumatic events that actually followed in their wake. Deep spaces of death and dismemberment in which dangerous pasts are consciously or unconsciously archived and repressed are not born out of those experiences, but establish the sanctified conditions of their mystification and retrieval. So the spaces themselves are not symptoms, they are conditions for the symptoms. To paraphrase my favorite philosopher, though all our historical knowledge begins with experience, it does not follow that it all arises out of experience. And to paraphrase Freud, paraphrasing the first creation of John, chapter 1, verse 1, in the beginning was the ritual archive. And now, thank you.